Okay, class, so we're getting into the third chapter on the study guide, which is African Americans Past and Present. And the first one we'll be looking at is industrialism, because that's number 26, but it's the first thing that appears here on the slide. So industrialism refers to basically how the shift in production went from farms to factories. Okay, so it was the rise of factories and rapid production during the late 1800s, early 1900s, which attracted people to major cities. And industrialism was important because it brought with it the racialization of neighborhoods. You had all these different immigrant groups coming into the cities in mass, and there just wasn't enough space for everybody. It actually caused for tenements to be created, which is what you see on the bottom right, where this immigrant family was living in a very small apartment because these apartments were being subdivided to be able to give people enough space to even stay in that area. And when people settled, they settled with their groups, you know, Irish with Irish, Italian with Italian, Asian people like Chinese Americans with Chinese Americans. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which will be number 25. And I have two questions on number 25, which is the Great Migration. And that occurred from the rural south to the urban north. So black families were coming from the south to the north. And there were two major reasons that we discussed in class. It was the lack of economic opportunity in the south because of the fact that the price of cotton had dropped. And also, one of the other major reasons was racial violence, the lynchings, the KKK, Jim Crow segregation. It was too much to bear. So these families decided to move. A lot of them ended up moving into the north, eastern, and then the midwestern areas. And then a small portion ended up moving to California, to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland. And you'll see that on this map here. You could see the areas that they went into for the Great Migration. But this one is a full map, which also shows you the migration corridors into this area. But yeah, mostly in the Midwest and in the northeast. Okay. This one here is Sundown Town, which is number 24 on your study guide. And this, I brought this up because people moving from the south to the north, or immigrants coming into the west or the north, did not necessarily get the best reception. They were still being met with discrimination, with racism. It wasn't just the South that was discriminatory. However, the South was known for the KKK and for Jim Crow segregation. And the North, in the North and in the West, it was a little bit more loose, like the regulations, but there was intimidation, and you can see it in the signs here. So sundown towns were the towns that told immigrants or told non-white people that they had to keep moving and to not let the sun set on them there, because then maybe they would be met with racial violence. Okay, so there was that fear. We talked about Lily White Linwood as a sundown town. We talked about the housing covenant, which is number 27, which is, a covenant attached to the deed of a house that declares that the property may be only occupied by white people. And those deeds are still attached to, these covenants are still attached to many of the deeds on in American houses. The next item we'll go into is institutional discrimination in housing, and we're looking at the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that was created by the FHA, which is the federal government's administration on housing. And the HOLC was a corporation that was going out to these different neighborhoods in the US and looking at the neighborhoods and deciding whether or not they would refinance homes for people in these neighborhoods. And it was millions of Americans that were refinanced this way. And they needed it because they had just gone through the Great Depression. So the Hulk sent out these assessors to rate the neighborhoods. They created maps off of that, and then loan decisions were made using these maps. But the researchers contend that they used discriminatory practices, discriminatory labeling, and that they privileged, more often than not, white people over non-white people and white neighborhoods over non-white neighborhoods. And white people were given loans at higher rates than blacks or Latinos or Asians. And here's an example of discriminatory labeling on Hulk maps. You could see that green is best and that red is hazardous. More often than not, you would have poor people living in these areas, and more often than not, non-white people. Okay, here's a redlining, a map, a Hulk map, but also to show redlining. So that's number 28 on your study guide. And redlining refers to the practice of lenders not lending to people that were in redlined areas. So they would take a marker and mark red lines around these areas where they designated that they would not lend money to these people. Again, more often than not, the areas that were redlined were areas containing non-white people, blacks, Latinos. Okay, and so because of that, blacks and Latinos were not able to buy homes or refinance their homes. Okay. And then you have the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and it was passed a week after King's assassination. He was already working on it before that, but it wasn't put to a vote until after his assassination. And it's considered the last four of the Great Civil Rights Act. And finally, it outlawed the refusal for people to sell to people based on their skin color or to rent to people based on their skin color. Okay, and it was a landmark act, but the damage had been done already by racism, by discrimination. That we see the home ownership rates among white people are much higher than among Hispanics or among blacks. Okay, so blacks the least likely to own a home, Hispanics just slightly more home ownership among them, but definitely not at the same level as white people. Okay, we looked at neighborhood changes after the Fair Housing Act, and I brought up white flight because now people would not be able to deny other people from moving into their neighborhood because of their skin color. So white people had to now be faced with this fact that black people or Latino people or Asian people were going to start moving into their neighborhood, you know, beyond their control. So when you started to see black or Latinos or Asians moving into these neighborhoods, white flight ensued. What does that mean? White people moved from the city to the suburbs, so further out into the suburban area, because they wanted to escape the influx of minorities. And so you can see how white flight occurred in Compton in the 1940s. So it was mostly white in Compton, but as soon as black people started to move in, the white people moved out because they were worried about their properties dropping in value or about black people or minorities bringing in crime and disease and sexual promiscuity. Okay. The other thing that you would see is white fight. So not all whites had the means to be able to move out of these neighborhoods into suburban areas. Some of these white people might have been recent immigrants themselves and did not have the means. So they had to stay and fight. Okay, so whites warded off non-white families with intimidation, protest, and violence. And the example I gave to you was of Nat King Cole and his daughter Natalie Cole when they lived in the Hancock Park neighborhood, and Nat King Cole had crosses burning on his lawn. They would put graffiti on his property. They would they poisoned one of his dogs. So just all these horrible intimidation tactics, but he wasn't scared off easily. So I was really happy about that he stood his ground and that he didn't let people intimidate him. So you could even see white fight in rich neighborhoods, which is quite interesting because this theory says that it mostly happened in lower income neighborhoods where whites were not able to move out. But you even see this in more rich neighborhoods. The other thing that I want you to look at is blockbusting, which is the practice of persuading owners to sell property cheaply because of the fear of people of another race or class moving into the neighborhood. And that's like, for example, a real estate agent hiring a black woman to walk through a neighborhood so that it would give the appearance that black people were moving in. And then that would cause white people to start panic selling their properties for low or below market rates. And then they would mark up the houses and sell them at above market rates to minorities. And that concludes the review for this presentation. Thank you.